The mountains had no mercy in January. That was the first thing Sergeant Dale Whitmore told his squad when they crossed the forward staging area at 0430 hours before the sun had any interest in rising. Before the cold, the briefing had been standard. Route reconnaissance. Radio relay confirmation. Estimated field time. 8 hours, maybe 10. Return before dark. He'd done it a dozen times in terrain like this, from Norway to the Rockies, and the formula never changed. What changed, this morning, was the girl sitting beside the Humvee. She was small. That was the first thing anyone noticed, and it was the thing they kept coming back to, the way a bad joke circles a room before it finds somewhere to die. Small and pale and wrapped in a standard-issue cold-weather jacket that was obviously a size too large, the sleeves folded back twice at the wrist. She had a canvas bag at her feet, and a radio unit balanced across her knees, an older model, AN/PRC 152, a field communications device the Corps hadn't prioritized replacing in remote training units like this one. She was checking the frequencies with one hand and writing something in a small olive-green notebook with the other, and she didn't look up when the squad gathered around the vehicles. Her name was Elena Voss, 22 years old, 5'3" on a generous morning, pale blonde hair pulled tight under a knit watch cap, eyes that were somewhere between gray and green depending on the light. And on this particular morning the light was the flat, undifferentiated white of a January sky over high elevation, and they looked like neither. She had been assigned to the squad as a communications specialist, radio relay, frequency confirmation, signal integrity during the route reconnaissance. Her orders were simple: maintain contact with base, translate positional data, stay close to the primary vehicle. She had not been given a rifle. Corporal Travis Beaumont noticed that last. He was the first one to say something. "They gave us a radio girl," he said, loud enough that it wasn't meant to be a private observation. He was 24, corn-fed, from somewhere flat in Ohio, and he had a knack for delivering contempt with a smile that made it harder to argue with. "That what that is?" Lance Corporal Pete Sadowski laughed. He was standing beside Beaumont with his rifle slung across his chest and his hood up against the wind, and he laughed the way people laugh when the joke isn't theirs but they want credit for appreciating it. "Probably here to read us the weather report." Elena Voss did not look up from her notebook. She wrote something, adjusted the squelch on the radio, wrote something else. Whitmore watched this and said nothing. He was 41, had been in long enough that most things bored him, and he ran his squad the way a man runs a kitchen. Things worked or they didn't, and the ones that didn't got replaced. He wasn't going to defend the girl. That wasn't his job. His job was to get his people up the mountain and back down again without anyone getting shot. "Mount up," he said. Corporal Nate Holloway climbed into the lead Humvee last, pulling the door shut against a gust that threw loose snow across the hood in a thin white curtain. He was older than Beaumont and Sadowski, quieter, and he'd been in long enough to have opinions that ran counter to the obvious ones. As the convoy started moving, he glanced back at the girl in the rear seat. She was already watching the tree line, the notebook open in her lap, the radio unit wedged between her knee and the door. He didn't say anything, but he filed it away, the way careful people file things they haven't understood yet. The road, calling it a road, was generous, climbed for 40 minutes through pine forest that grew denser as the elevation increased, the trees pressing close on both sides until the convoy was moving through what felt like a tunnel of dark branches and filtered gray light. The snow was deep here, packed by wind into drifts that narrowed the track in places to barely the width of a single vehicle. Twice, the lead Humvee had to slow to a crawl while the tires found their purchase on ice beneath the powder. Elena watched the tree line the entire time. She made a small sound, not a word, not quite, and adjusted the squelch twice more. Her finger moved along a particular frequency, stopped, moved back. "There's interference on frequency 34, she said. Her voice was quiet and level, the kind of voice that doesn't waste effort on volume. "It's patterned, not random." Beaumont, riding in the front passenger seat, turned around to look at her. "Everything's patterned when you're looking for patterns. That's weather bounce. We're in a mountain valley. Weather bounce is irregular," she said. "This isn't." "Write it down in your little notebook," Sadowski said from beside her. He wasn't being cruel, exactly. He was being the thing that passes for ordinary when cruelty is available and nothing prevents it. Elena wrote it down in her notebook. Outside, the pines thinned as the elevation climbed, and the sky opened up white and vast and empty in the way that high altitude made everything empty, as though the world had been cleared of everything that wasn't essential. The ridge was visible now, a long dark spine of rock dusted with snow, running east to west across the upper face of the mountain. Their objective was a radio relay point on the western end. They would confirm signal integrity, document the positional data, and come back down. Simple. Whitmore told himself it was simple. Corporal Holloway had stopped looking at the tree line the way a person stops looking at something when they've realized they should. The convoy parked at the base of the final ascent, terrain too steep and too uneven for vehicles, and the squad dismounted and began the climb on foot. The wind had picked up, coming in from the west in long sustained gusts that threw loose crystals of snow horizontally across the slope and made every exposed surface sting. Temperature was somewhere around -18 Celsius, the kind of cold that was patient, that waited for the gaps in your gear and worked its way in through them. Elena carried her radio unit in one hand and her canvas bag in the other. She climbed steadily without complaining, without falling behind, and without talking. Beaumont, watching her from behind, had expected the bag to slow her down. It didn't. She moved like someone accustomed to wait in uneven terrain, and the way she placed her feet, deliberate, tested, committed, was different from the way the others climbed. Nobody said anything about it. 40 minutes up, they reached a natural shelf in the rock where the slope temporarily leveled before rising again toward the ridge. Whitmore called a short stop. Water. Equipment check. The relay point was another 20 minutes above them, and above that, the ridge itself open, exposed, commanding a view of the entire valley below. Elena set down her canvas bag and opened the radio unit. She was adjusting the antenna, a small telescoping rod with a precision that was, if you were paying attention, unusual. Most radio operators worked with their equipment the way people worked with any tool they'd used long enough. Quickly, practically, without ceremony. Elena worked with hers the way a watchmaker worked, attentive to small things, economical in movement, aware of tolerances. Holloway was watching her. She caught the signal again, the patterned interference she'd noted in the vehicle. She wrote down the frequency, the interval, and what she estimated as the approximate bearing based on the signal strength differential between the antenna's primary and secondary orientations. Still getting it, she said, to no one in particular. Still not caring, Beaumont said, from 20 feet away, pulling a protein bar from his vest pocket. The interval is 9 seconds, Elena said. That's not weather. That's a carrier signal on a burst transmission cycle. Whitmore looked at her. Meaning someone is using a radio within line of sight range, on a frequency that's close to ours. She looked up from her notebook. Probably not someone who should be. There was a silence that lasted long enough to be awkward and not long enough to be productive. Could be civilian equipment, Holloway said carefully. Could be, Elena agreed. The modulation pattern doesn't match civilian equipment I've seen. It matches a compression format used for burst transmission in tactical communications. She paused, but I could be wrong. Whitmore studied her for a moment. His expression didn't change. We continue to the relay point, he said. We do our job, log the observation, and we'll pass it up when we're back in range. Elena nodded once and wrote something in her notebook. What she wrote was, East Slope. Elevation advantage estimated 120 m above relay point. 3 or more sources. Pattern consistent with position coordination signal. They know where we're going. She closed the notebook and picked up her canvas bag. Holloway, who had been close enough to see the first line before she closed it, said nothing. He increased his interval from the man ahead of him and started watching the east ridge. The last stretch to the relay point was the worst of 40-degree slope, with loose snow over solid ice beneath, requiring 3 points of contact at any given time and a level of patience that was in increasingly short supply as the cold worked deeper into fingers and knees. The relay equipment was housed in a weatherproof box bolted to a rock outcropping, half buried in snowdrift. Whitmore and Beaumont started on the access panel while Sadowski and 2 others, Corporal Dennis Ruck and PFC Aaron Yount, spread out to maintain a loose perimeter. Elena set up her radio unit beside the relay box and began the signal verification process. She was also doing something else, but she did it quietly enough that nobody noticed. She had extended the antenna to its maximum length and oriented it with careful attention to the east slope, the direction her notebook said was relevant, and she was watching the signal on the secondary frequency, the way a person watches something they expect to move. At 1,147 hours, it moved. The signal on frequency 34 dropped to 0. Elena went still. She looked up at the east slope. 800 meters of open snow, the surface broken by wind-carved ridges and scattered rock outcroppings, rising to the spine of the ridge. Nothing moved. Nothing was visible. The wind worked across it without interruption. She reached into her canvas bag, not for the radio, not for her notebook. She kept her hand there for a moment, fingers finding what they were looking for, and then she withdrew it and kept working on the signal verification. At 1,153 hours, Corporal Dennis Ruck was shot. The sound of it came a long time after. That was the thing that took a half-second too long to process the way the impact arrived before the report. The sound catching up after some delay that the wind stretched out and distorted. Ruck went down on the slope to the left of the relay point, dropping straight without the dramatic backward motion that movies had trained everyone to expect. One moment he was standing, the next he wasn't. The snow around him was briefly red. Sadowski started shouting. Yount dropped flat. Beaumont came off the relay box with his rifle up and no target. Because there was no target, the east slope was still empty, the wind still moving across it in long cold curtains. Whitmore was behind the rock outcropping and already talking into his radio, voice flat and controlled. Position, situation, 1 casualty, requesting immediate support. He was good at his job. He didn't panic. He filed the information he had and requested the information he needed, and kept himself low while he did it. Elena Voss was no longer at her radio. Nobody noticed for 30 seconds. They were busy being shot at. A second round came in while Sadowski was still shouting, taking a chunk out of the rock outcropping 3 feet from Whitmore's left shoulder, the report arriving 2 seconds later from somewhere so far away it might as well have been a different mountain. Yount started crawling toward Ruck. Beaumont was firing at nothing, 3 controlled bursts into the empty east slope which accomplished nothing, except making the rest of them feel marginally less alone in the cold. Holloway noticed. He looked at the radio units still running, signal verification still in progress on the secondary screen, the antenna oriented east. He looked at the canvas bag, which was still there, which meant she hadn't taken it, which meant she hadn't taken everything she'd brought. He looked at the slope. There were footprints in the snow leading away from the relay point, heading not downhill toward the vehicles but laterally traversing the face of the slope, moving eastward and upward simultaneously, following the contour of the terrain toward a long natural depression that cut across the slope about 200 meters above them. The prints were small. The stride was efficient. Whoever made them had been moving fast. "Boss," he said, to no one. Sadowski was flat on his stomach behind a rock with his rifle up, and a view of nothing useful. Beaumont had stopped firing, and was crouching, breathing hard, scanning. Whitmore was still on the radio to base. Yount had reached Ruck, and was doing what could be done, which wasn't much. Holloway looked at the footprints. He looked at the ridge. "Where's the radio tech?" Beaumont called. Nobody answered. The wind filled the silence the way it fills everything at altitude, patiently, completely, without interest in what it displaced. Nobody was looking for her. That was the part that mattered. In the scramble of the first ambush, in the shouting and the scrambling for cover and the controlled chaos of a squad taking fire from an unknown position, the accounting of personnel was not the priority. The priority was survival. The priority was cover and return fire and radio contact. Nobody was counting heads. Nobody was asking where the girl with the radio had gone. This was, she understood, something she depended on. Not because she exploited it, not cynically, not with pleasure, but because it was structural. The assessment was already made. It had been made at 0430, before the vehicles moved. Small, quiet, radio girl. The assessment locked the template in place, and the template did not update automatically when the situation changed. People saw what they expected to see, and what they expected to see was still sitting at the relay point with the frequency log and the signal verification screen. Nobody was looking for her. She had left her canvas bag because the canvas bag had been a container, not an asset. What she'd removed from it 3 separate times over the course of the morning, in pieces, with the casual economy of motion that characterized everything she did, was now either assembled or soon to be. The Chaytak M200 was a large-caliber precision rifle. Not light, not small, not a weapon that anyone carried casually or deployed opportunistically. It was a weapon that required commitment to carry it, to configure it, to use it, and the commitment began before the mission, in the decision to bring it, and in the decision to bring it disguised as nothing in particular. Elena lay in the snow along the upper edge of the natural depression. She had been moving for 11 minutes since she'd left the relay point, and she had covered 240 meters of uneven terrain in that time at an elevation gain of approximately 60 meters, and her breathing was controlled not because she was not exerting herself, but because she had long practice at keeping her breathing controlled when she was exerting herself, and the practice had become something indistinguishable from instinct. Her heart rate was elevated. She noted it, adjusted for it, and moved on. The rifle was configured. She'd worked in the depression, which offered concealment from both the relay point below and the ridge above. And she'd worked quickly. She knew the sequence, the way musicians know their scales, without the intermediary step of thinking. Bipod deployed, chamber checked, optic verified. The scope was a Schmidt and Bender 5.25x5.6, analog, with a mil-dot reticle. No electronics to fail in the cold. No battery to die at the critical moment. Just glass and geometry and the patience to use them correctly. She pulled herself to the top of the depression and looked at the ridge. 400 meters of open slope above her. The ridge itself, the long dark spine, ran left to right across her field of view, and along its western section, where the rock was broken and irregular, she could see 3 positions. She identified them not because they were obviously occupied, but because she knew what to look for. The geometry was wrong. Small disturbances in the snowfield that weren't wind caused a slight shadow that the angle of the sun didn't account for. A dark line against white that was fractionally too regular. She lay still and counted 3 positions, roughly 40-meter intervals. The leftmost and rightmost were higher, flanking the central position. The central position had the best line of sight to the relay point below. 3 Muktiu, she said quietly, and then caught herself in English. 3 targets. She pulled the notebook from her chest pocket. Wrote down the positions, the estimated ranges, the wind. The wind was the problem. It was coming from the west at an angle that made it approximately perpendicular to her line of fire to the rightmost position and increasingly parallel to her line of fire to the leftmost. The central position was the cleanest shot. She had calculated the drift for all 3 positions during the climb, running the numbers in her head the way she'd been running numbers since she was 17 years old. In a cold field in Pennsylvania with her father watching from behind her and saying nothing because there was nothing useful to say while she was learning. She set up on the central position. Range, 620 meters. Wind, 8 knots west, northwest, gusting to 11, averaging 9. Temperature, minus 18 Celsius. Altitude, approximately 2,400 meters above sea level. All of these were variables. All of them had corrections. She ran the corrections with the same methodical absence of anxiety that characterized the rest of her work, because anxiety was not useful and the numbers were what they were regardless of how she felt about them. She identified the target. She breathed in. She breathed out. She let the pause between breaths do what it was supposed to do. The first shot was on the central position. The sound of it was very small in that much open space. A crack, high and brief, that the wind caught immediately and broke apart and distributed across the slope in fragments until it was indistinguishable from what the mountain made on its own. Below, at the relay point, Holloway heard it or thought he heard it, and looked upward at the wrong place. He was looking at the east ridge. The shot had come from the depression 2/3 of the way up the slope, from a position that to anyone below appeared to be empty snow. The central position on the ridge went still. Elena had already moved her attention to the right. The right position was 680 meters. Wind angle was more favorable here. She was shooting with a component of the wind rather than perpendicular to it, which simplified the hold but introduced drift she had to account for. She adjusted, breathed. The target in the right position had moved, not fleeing, not yet, because nobody at 680 meters from a suppressed shot in a high wind had processed what was happening but shifted slightly, turning toward the central position, which was the predictable response to hearing something fall nearby. It meant the angle was slightly different from what she'd calculated. She adjusted. Second shot. The right position went still. Now there was movement on the ridge. The left position, the one she'd flagged as highest, with the most commanding view of the valley, was pulling back. Whoever was there had figured out that something was wrong, had heard two things fall in the snow with no accompanying sound of contact, and had decided that discretion was the operational priority. Elena felt them move. Not see them, not precisely, not yet, but read it in the small changes in the snow's surface as they disturbed it, in the shift of a shadow she'd been tracking at the edge of her scope's field of view. They were moving laterally, parallel to the ridge, toward a rock outcropping that would give cover from her current position. She had anticipated this. She had anticipated it because it was the correct tactical response, and she had run the scenario during the climb. And in her version of the scenario, the third position would make a lateral move toward cover, and the cover would be the outcropping, and from the outcropping, the angle would be such that she would have approximately a 6-second window before the terrain blocked her line of fire completely. She tracked the movement. She breathed. The shadow moved into the edge of her window. Third shot. The ridge was still. She lay in the depression and did not move for a full 30 seconds, watching. The ridge gave nothing back, no movement, no new shadows, no geometry that was wrong. The wind worked across it. The snow drifted in long, low curtains from the western face. Nothing alive was moving on the upper slope. She pulled her eye from the scope and looked at the sky. It was the same flat January white it had been all morning. It had not changed to account for what had just happened. The mountain did not know the difference. The cold was exactly as cold as it had been 3 minutes ago. She began breaking down the rifle. She worked with the same economy she had used, assembling it quick, sequential, nothing wasted. The component pieces went back to where they'd been, distributed through her jacket and vest pockets. Nothing that looked like anything in particular. She spent 2 minutes smoothing the depression in the snow where she'd been lying, not to perfection but to adequacy enough that the casual eye wouldn't read it as an occupied position. Then she picked up her notebook, wrote down the range and the wind speed and the time, and added a single line. All 3 targets neutralized. Return to relay point. She put the notebook in her chest pocket. She started back down the slope. Below, at the relay point, the shooting had stopped. Not paused. Stopped. The last hostile round had come in approximately 7 minutes before the silence became something they could feel a presence of its own. The way silence after sustained threat becomes heavier than ordinary quiet. Beaumont had stopped firing. Sadowski was behind his rock with his rifle up and nobody to point it at. Whitmore was still transmitting coordinates, but his voice had taken on a slightly different quality, still controlled, still professional, but with an undercurrent of uncertainty that had not been there before. Something had changed. Contact? Yount called from Ruck's position. Negative, Sadowski answered. Then why'd they stop? Nobody had an answer. Holloway was looking at the slope above. He had been looking at it continuously since he'd noticed the footprints, tracking the point where they disappeared into the terrain fold. And in his experience, when things like this happened, there was always a reason, and the reasons were usually either very good or very bad, and you didn't always know which until afterward. The silence stretched. 2 minutes. 3. They're repositioning, Beaumont said. He was trying to sound confident about it. They got spooked. Support's inbound. They pulled back. Support's 40 minutes out, Whitmore said, pulling the radio from his ear. Then they're regrouping. Whatever. Beaumont shifted behind his rock. Point is, they stopped. Something stopped them, Holloway said quietly. The wind was the only answer. At 6 minutes of silence, Whitmore called the all-clear cautious, qualified, with instructions to maintain cover and not assume contact was terminated. He sent Sadowski and Yount to check Ruck, who was alive but serious, stable enough for transport if they moved efficiently. he sent Beaumont to finish the relay verification. He kept himself at the primary position and watched the east slope. He was watching the east slope when the small figure appeared on the terrain about 180 meters above, moving steadily downhill. Small, deliberate, no rifle visible, canvas bag in one hand. He stared. She climbed back over the lip of the relay point position, stepped around the rock outcropping where his shoulder had been, and sat back down at her radio unit. She checked the signal verification status on the secondary screen. She adjusted the squelch. She wrote a number in her notebook. Voss, Whitmore said. Sergeant, where were you? I was maintaining signal continuity. She looked at the screen. The verification is at 94%. It'll be complete in about 4 minutes. He looked at her. She looked at the screen. Voss. Signals clean on all primary frequencies, she said. The interference on 34 has stopped. Whoever was transmitting on it isn't transmitting anymore. She turned the notebook page. I've documented the bearing, the frequency, and the time the signal went dark. You'll want it for the after-action report. Whitmore studied her for a long moment. His expression was the expression of a man who was rearranging information into a new configuration and wasn't quite finished. Did you? He started. Verification is complete, she said. We can begin descent whenever you're ready, Sergeant. She closed the notebook. Beaumont, who had come back from the relay box in time to hear the last of this exchange, looked at her. He looked at the slope above. He looked at the canvas bag. He looked at the slope again. He didn't say anything. They found the positions on the climb down. Not intentionally, the descent route passed along the upper portion of the slope that the east approach had crossed, and it was Holloway who spotted the first position, then called a halt. The position was in a natural hollow between two rock outcroppings, wind-sheltered, with a commanding line of sight to the relay point below and the approach routes from all directions. It was occupied equipment, or it had been. The equipment was still there. The person who had been using it was there too, in the specific and permanent way that ended things. Nobody said much. They moved to the second position, then the third. The third one told the story most clearly, because whoever had been there had been in the process of moving when they were stopped halfway between their position and a rock outcropping 15 meters away. The geometry of it, the way the body had come to rest, told Holloway something about where the shot had come from. He looked at the slope below, at the terrain, and identified the most likely position. He looked at the depression in the snow, about 240 meters away on the mid-slope, where something had made the snow slightly irregular. From this distance it was almost undetectable. Almost. He looked at Elena, who was walking past him toward the descent with her canvas bag and her radio unit and her olive green notebook. He didn't say anything for a while. They descended the last section in silence, real silence, not the absence of talking that passes for silence in a group, but the kind that means something has settled into the space between people and is too large to talk past. Beaumont walked without the easy confidence he'd had on the way up. Sadowski kept his eyes down. Yount was helping with Ruck's litter and didn't have attention to spare for anything else. Whitmore walked beside Holloway. She had a rifle, Holloway said, after a while. Not a question. She had something, Whitmore said. She broke down 3 positions from somewhere around 240 to 680 meters, on a crosswind, in -18, with nobody knowing she was there. Holloway paused. In about 10 minutes, Whitmore said nothing. Holloway stopped, thought about it. In 12 years, I've never seen. No, Whitmore agreed. They walked. The canvas bag, Holloway said. Don't, Whitmore said. The canvas bag was back in Elena's hand, carried without ceremony or self-consciousness. It looked like a canvas bag carrying radio equipment. The weight distribution was exactly what it should have been. He'd watched her carry it all morning, on the way up, and it had moved the same way then as it moved now. Whatever had been in it had come out in pieces, and in pieces it had gone back in. And the sum of the pieces was not visible because the sum of the pieces was less about hardware than about knowledge. And knowledge didn't weigh anything. At the bottom of the slope, waiting beside the Humvees, Holloway walked past Elena and stopped. Hey, he said. She looked at him. That note you wrote, on the slope. He paused. About the signal going dark. Yes, you knew. She looked at him for a long moment. Her eyes, in the flat white light of the late afternoon, were the gray-green of old fieldstone. I observed an irregular pattern signal on a tactical burst frequency, she said. I documented my observation. The signal stopped. Holloway held her gaze. Okay, he said. Okay, she said. She walked to the rear of the second Humvee and loaded her equipment. The debrief was at 1,900 hours, in a prefab at the forward staging area, 4 portable heaters running, and a folding table covered in topographic maps. The operations officer was Lieutenant Colonel Patricia Renner, mid-40s, close-cropped hair, the kind of stillness that comes from having processed a great many things that required processing. She had been in the Corps for 22 years and had spent the last decade in roles that required her to manage information rather than territory, to decide what was recorded and what was not, what was named and what remained unnamed, what the file said and what the file did not say. She was extraordinarily good at it, not because she was deceptive but because she understood that truth had more shapes than most people gave it credit for, and that the administrative shape and the operational shape were not always identical. She listened to Whitmore's account without interrupting. She looked at the photographs that had been transmitted from the 3 positions on the ridge. She looked at the estimated ranges and the trajectory analysis and the shot placement documentation. She was quiet for a while. "The radio specialist," she said. "Yes, ma'am. She has a designation." Renner looked at the file on the table. "Specialist Elena Voss. Assigned to this unit as a communications technician." "Yes, ma'am. And the communications verification is complete." "Yes, ma'am. 94% on primary, full signal integrity." Renner looked at the trajectory analysis again. She looked at the photograph of the 3rd position, the body, the geometry of where it had fallen in relation to where it had been moving. She looked at the estimated shot origin on the mid-slope. "Someone has been here before," she said. "Ma'am?" "This individual." She didn't use Elena's name again. "Someone with this skill set has been deployed in an environment like this before. That is not a first-time performance." She set the photograph down. "Ghost sniper," Whitmore said. "Ma'am, it's a designation," Renner said. "Not a name. A designation. It's been used in 3 previous incident files over the past 4 years, all in cold weather conditions, all in positions that should not have been tenable for a single operator." She paused. "Always listed under a different official role." The room was quiet. "Always female?" Holloway asked. Renner looked at him. "The files don't specify." She stood up. "The after-action report will document communications specialist performance. The anomalous events on the ridge will be attributed to the arrival of support elements ahead of schedule due to favorable flight conditions." She looked around the room. "Does anyone have a question about that?" Nobody had a question about that. "Specialist Voss's documentation remains as filed," Renner said. "Radio specialist, communications technician, signal verification, January operation." She gathered the topographic maps. "That's all she is." She left the room. In the silence that followed, Sadowski said, quietly, to no one in particular, "What just happened?" "We got lucky," Whitmore said, and his voice had a flatness to it that made the word lucky carry more weight than it usually did. Beaumont was looking at the table. He had been looking at the table throughout the debrief. He had the expression of a man revising something fundamental, working through it methodically, not enjoying the process. He had not called her radio girl since 11:53 hours that morning, when Ruck had gone down. He hadn't said much at all. Elena was in the radio room when Holloway found her. The radio room was small, a converted storage space with equipment racks along 2 walls and a single workstation in the center. She was doing maintenance on the AN PRC 152, which did not require maintenance after 8 hours in the field but which gave her something to do with her hands, which was sometimes the same thing. The olive-green notebook was open on the workstation beside her, but she was looking at the opposite page from the operational notes, an older page, from a different insertion, a different mountain. He knocked on the doorframe. She closed the notebook. "Corporal Holloway, I'm not here to ask questions," he said. "Okay." He leaned against the doorframe. He was the kind of tall that made him slightly too large for small spaces, and he compensated for it with a habitual careful stillness. "Ruck's going to be fine," he said. "They got him to the aid station. Round went through the shoulder. Missed anything important." "Good," she said. "Yeah." He was quiet for a moment. "You knew the positions before we even reached the relay point." "I had a hypothesis," she said, "based on the signal, based on several things." She looked at the radio, the signal, the terrain, the approach route, the fact that if you were going to establish a position to interdict reconnaissance at that relay point, there are about 4 choices of terrain that make sense, and the one that makes the most sense is the one with elevation advantage on the east face. It gives you coverage of the entire approach. She paused. It also gives you vulnerability from mid-slope if someone gets there without being seen, because the east face shooter is looking at the relay point, Holloway said. "They're not looking at mid-slope." "They're not looking at mid-slope," she agreed. He thought about it. "How long have you been running this kind of operation?" She looked at him. He raised a hand. "I said I wasn't going to ask questions." "You did say that." "Sorry." She looked at the radio again. On the workstation beside the notebook was a small photograph, face down, which she had placed face down before he'd come in, or possibly had been face down before that. He didn't ask about it. He understood the geometry of a face-down photograph in an operational environment. It was private in the way that anything carried close to the body was private, meaningful in a direction that was nobody else's business. "Beaumont," he said. "What about him?" "He wants to apologize." She was quiet for a moment. "Tell him not to." "Because you don't want an apology?" "Because an apology means we have to have a conversation," she said. "And a conversation means we both have to think about what happened this morning, and what each of us was doing this morning, and what each of us knew about the other. And none of that is useful." She made a small adjustment to the radio's squelch control. "Tell him to just do his job. I'll do mine." "That's fine." Holloway considered this. "That's a reasonable position. It's the position I have." He pushed off the doorframe. "You want coffee?" "The mess has that machine that makes the kind that tastes like burned ambition." but it's hot. For the first time all day, the corner of her mouth moved in a way that might have been the leading edge of something that wasn't quite a smile but was in the neighborhood. Burnt ambition sounds fine, she said. They left the staging area at 0600 the following morning. The convoy route back to the main base was 4 hours in good conditions, and the conditions were, by January mountain standards, adequate. Overcast, calm, temperature risen to something near -10 with the sun still absent. The vehicles moved efficiently. The radios were quiet. Nobody talked more than necessary, which was not unusual for a unit moving out of a cold weather operation, but had a different quality this morning, a particular attentiveness, a deliberateness in the silence, as though everyone was paying attention to something they had not previously considered worth paying attention to. Elena was in the second Humvee, rear seat, left side, radio unit on her knee and notebook open in her lap. She was looking at the trees as they passed pine forest again, dense and dark and uniform in the way that forests at this elevation were uniform, which was to say completely, without variation, without exception. The trees scrolled past. The road unwound. The convoy moved south. Beaumont was in the front passenger seat. At the 40-minute mark, he half-turned. He did not speak. He looked at her for 2 seconds and then turned back to face the road ahead. That was all. Elena noted it. She wrote something in her notebook, not about the operation, not coordinates, or frequencies, or trajectory calculations, but something else, something shorter, in the margin of a page that already had operational notes from 3 days ago. She capped the pen and looked back out the window. The trees were the same trees. At the 2-hour mark, PFC Aaron Yount, who was driving the second Humvee with the particular careful competence of someone who had been thinking about something for a long time and had arrived at a conclusion he wasn't sure how to express, said, "Hey." Elena looked at him in the mirror. "Ruck wants to know who to thank," Yount said. "When he's out, he wants to know." She looked at the mirror for a moment. "Tell him to thank whoever called support," she said. "And the medics." Yount was quiet. "Tell him it was a team operation," she said. "Tell him that's all it was." Yount didn't say anything else. The convoy moved south through the pine forest, through the narrowing light of a January morning, through the cold that had no particular interest in any of them, and would persist long after the vehicles had passed and the tracks in the snow had filled and the ridge had reasserted its ordinary character, which was the character of stone and snow and wind and the long-accumulated patience of elevation. At the staging area debrief, the documentation read as follows: reconnaissance operation completed successfully. Relay verification confirmed. Minor hostile contact resolved by supporting elements. 1 friendly casualty, non-fatal. Specialist Voss, E. Radio verification completed. Signal integrity confirmed. Performance satisfactory. Performance satisfactory. In the rear of the second Humvee, Elena Voss closed her notebook and looked out the window for the last 40 minutes of the drive. The forest thinned as the elevation dropped. The trees gave way to cleared land, to the perimeter fence of the main installation, to the guard post and the gate and the ordinary world that existed below the ridge. She did not look relieved. She did not look triumphant. She looked, if anything, exactly the same as she had looked at 0430 hours the previous morning, sitting beside the Humvee with the radio unit across her knees and the notebook open and her eyes on the tree line, as though the whole thing had been a matter of frequency verification, signal integrity, attention to things that others had decided were not worth their attention. The gate opened. The convoy passed through. In the vehicle behind her, Holloway watched the gate close and thought about footprints in the snow, and about the difference between what people were called and what they were, and about the particular quality of a silence that settles over a ridge after everything that needs to happen has happened, and nobody is left to see it who doesn't already know. He had been in for 12 years. He had not seen that before. He suspected he would not see it again. Or maybe, and this was the thought he kept returning to, working over it the way you work over a stone that has an unusual weight, maybe he would see it again, because it had always been there, in rooms and convoys and relay points and radio stations, sitting quietly with its notebook and its attention to frequencies that others had decided weren't worth monitoring, waiting for the moment when the mountain asked for it, and giving what was asked, and coming back down and sitting at the radio and writing the number in the log, and saying nothing. The world was full of frequencies that went unmonitored. The dangerous ones were the quiet ones. The convoy pulled into the motor pool. Doors opened. Equipment came out. People dispersed to debrief stations and mess halls and medical and admin, the machinery of an operation closing down with the practiced efficiency of a unit that had done this many times. Elena Voss walked to the equipment bay and returned the AN, PRC, 152 to its rack. She signed the equipment log. She clocked out at the communications station. She walked to the barracks. She set the canvas bag on her bunk. She took the face-down photograph from her chest pocket and looked at it. A man on a slope, older, wearing cold weather gear, a rifle across his back, looking at the camera with an expression that was somewhere between instruction and pride. Behind him, a ridge, snow, the flat white sky of winter at altitude. She had carried this photograph for 4 years. through 3 different unit assignments and 2 different operational theaters and more cold mornings on high ground than she could immediately account for. Her father had taken her up into the Pennsylvania mountains for the first time when she was 14, and she had been a poor shot that first year, inconsistent and frustrated, and he had never once raised his voice about it, had only said, "You're arguing with the wind. Stop arguing, listen to it." She had not understood what that meant for another 6 months, until the morning it stopped being metaphor and became instruction, until she understood that listening was not passive but was the most active work she knew how to do. He was gone now, 3 years. The mountains had nothing to do with it. The cold had nothing to do with it. It was an ordinary thing that happened to people in ordinary ways, in hospitals, in warm rooms, and she had been somewhere cold and high when it happened and had not been there, and that was a fact. She carried the way. She carried the rifle broken down into pieces, distributed, not visible from the outside. She held it for a moment, placed it on the bunk beside her, lay down, closed her eyes. Outside, the wind moved through the installation the same way it moved through everything, without preference, without distinction, carrying what it found and leaving no record of what it had taken. The ridge was already forgetting them. The snow was already filling the depression in the slope where she had lain. In the motor pool, somebody had started calling the event by a name, not officially, not in any document, but in the way that names arise in small groups when something happens that needs a name. Silent Ridge. They said it quietly at first, the way you say a thing when you're not sure it should be said, and then more easily, and then as though it had always been called that, as though the ridge itself had chosen the name and they were only using it. She would not have cared about the name. Names were for people who needed the outside of things to match the inside, who needed the record to confirm what had happened. She kept her own records, in an olive green notebook, in margins and on numbered pages, in the particular shorthand she had developed over 4 years in cold weather on high ground ranges, wind speeds, adjustments, times, positions. Observations that no one else had made, documented with the care of someone who understood that attention was the only thing that couldn't be issued by the Corps and couldn't be taken away from you either. Somewhere on the east face of the ridge, the snow was filling 3 positions. The wind was the same wind. The cold had no memory. But cold was not the only thing up there, and memory was not the only kind of record, and the silence that had settled over the ridge at approximately 1,209 hours on a January morning was the specific and permanent kind of silence that settles when something that was in motion has stopped and everything that was in danger has been given back another morning, and the person responsible for that exchange has already walked away down the slope without a word, carrying her equipment in a canvas bag that looked like nothing in particular. The barracks room was quiet. Outside, the wind worked its way through the installation the same way it worked its way through every space that was open to it, without preference, without urgency, without any awareness of the lives conducted in the spaces it passed through. It had been working the ridge all morning. It had been working the depression in the slope where she had lain. It was working the empty positions on the east face right now, filling them incrementally with drifted snow, smoothing over the evidence of occupation with the same patience it used on everything. It did not know the difference. That was the thing about cold country, high ground, winter operations in mountains that didn't care. The mountain would not remember. The ridge would not carry the story. In 3 days, the snow would have covered the positions completely, the depression would be indistinguishable from the natural contour of the slope, and nothing would remain on the face of the mountain to indicate that anything had happened there at all, that 3 trained operators had occupied those positions and had gone silent one after another in the space of 11 minutes, while a person they had never seen moved unseen through the terrain below them. The only record that existed was in an olive green notebook, and in the permanent quiet of the ridge. She slept.